All right, this is the fourth and final section for Chapter 7 in biology over human genetics and pedigrees. Your objectives in this video are to examine patterns of inheritance in humans and also to describe how a pedigree is used. Our first definition is that pedigree. It's a chart used to trace phenotypes in a family, so you're watching some trait and how it's passed on from one generation to the next. Oftentimes, pedigree is actually used for dogs, if you've heard that before. There's a brand of dog food called pedigree, but specifically we're going to be talking about humans and their traits and tracking those over time. So that's for this example, these examples that we do. Right? Phenotypes can be used to infer genotypes. A few things that you need to know about pedigrees so that we can go through this and work with it and do it are that when you see a square, it's supposed to represent a boy. And a circle represents a girl. And any line connecting a boy and a girl means that they are a mating couple. And anything connected from that line would be their offspring. Right? There are multiple generations. You'll see one here in a second. But remember, square is a boy, circle is a girl. So these two pedigrees on this page are examples that we're going to work with, right? One of these pedigrees that we're going to work with is going to be recessive for sure. The other one, we're going to do it like it's dominant, although it could possibly be recessive, so we'll also be doing that as well. So if you draw these, draw the first one once, the second one you're going to have to draw it twice. Right? So just wait until after we're done with this slide and then redraw it in the margin somewhere, but you're going to need pictures for 3 different pedigrees when it's all said and done. So we're going to look at tracking dominant and recessive traits. We're also going to look at possible sex-linked traits if it is a recessive thing that we're looking for. But this first pedigree on the left is going to represent a recessive trait. And we know that automatically because it skips a generation. The filled-in individuals are affected by this trait or have this trait, depending on what it is. I might say affected by this trait if it's a disease or a disorder. I might say that they have this trait if it was just tracking blue eyes. But Grandpa in this pedigree on the left is affected by the trait, and his granddaughter at the bottom also has this trait. We know that it's recessive because it skipped a generation. And if it's a recessive trait, we're going to be looking for carriers, and we're going to have to mark those carriers. So you see the phenotypes in a pedigree. You have to be able to infer genotypes from those phenotypes. Since this is a recessive trait, I know that the grandpa is going to have 2 recessive alleles, and I know that the granddaughter also has 2 recessive alleles. But I'm going to have to figure out and infer what everybody else has. Now, since Grandpa has 2 recessive alleles and he has this trait that we're tracking, you know that both of his offspring are going to have at least 1 recessive allele. But you also know that each of his offspring are going to have a dominant allele because they do not show that trait, they do not have it. So I know that these 2 individuals, the daughter and the son, are heterozygous. If you have a heterozygous individual, an individual that you know is carrying that recessive trait, you need to fill it in halfway to represent that. I'm going to fill this girl in halfway. I'm going to fill in the son halfway as well. That represents them as carriers. Other individuals in this pedigree can be labeled as well, but I don't always know what the second allele is going to be. Grandma has to have a dominant allele because she does not show that recessive trait. But I really don't know if that second allele is dominant or recessive. she passed on a dominant trait to both of her offspring. So it is possible that both alleles are dominant, but it's also possible that she just never passed on that second recessive allele. So I don't know enough about grandma to mark it any further than I have so far. I have to leave a blank because I'm not really sure if she's going to be homozygous dominant or heterozygous for that trait. When I look in that second generation with mom and dad there, dad is a carrier, but mom also has to be a carrier, and I know that automatically because her daughter is affected. The only way that the daughter can be affected is if she gets that recessive allele from mom and dad. So I do know the mother's phenotype in that second generation. In the third generation, the grandchildren, I know at least that each individual is going to have a dominant allele, but there's really no way that I can tell, unless maybe they have offspring of their own, whether or not that second allele is dominant or recessive. So this first pedigree on the left is finished at this point. You might want to put a label on it up at the top and recognize that it is a recessive trait that we're looking at. And this is how you would fill it out. There should be carriers if it's recessive. The next thing we need to do is we need to look at, if it's recessive, can it also be sex-linked? Now, I know looking at this that it's not sex-linked. And the reason I know that is because dad in the second generation has to be a carrier. And we talked about sex-linked traits in that section 1 of this chapter. And we know that males cannot be carriers. So if the granddaughter is affected, her dad is going to have to be affected. He's going to have that trait. So this is my key right here that I'm looking at. I know it's not sex-linked because I have a carrier that's a male. So again, I know it's recessive because it skipped a generation. I know it's not sex-linked because there was a male that had to be a carrier, and that's not possible. So now we're going to move on to this pedigree on the right. In this pedigree, I actually can't tell if it's dominant or recessive. It did not skip a generation in this case, but not all recessive traits are automatically going to skip a generation. I'm going to fill this one out like it's dominant right now. But I don't actually know that it's dominant. But if it is dominant, that means that each person that's affected has to have at least one of those dominant alleles. I don't necessarily know what the second allele is right away, so I'm not going to fill that in automatically. But I know that they all have at least one dominant allele. All the unaffected individuals, though, in a dominant trait, are showing that recessive version of that gene. So I can automatically fill all of them in as homozygous recessive because that's what they'd have to be to not have that dominant trait. Now I can do a little bit more. Because I know that the grandma in this pedigree has 2 recessive alleles, all of her offspring are going to get a recessive allele from her. So the mom in the second generation and that uncle, I guess, if you want to call him something, in that generation, should both have a recessive allele to go with their dominant allele. So I do know their genotype. But then I look at that third generation, I also should know the daughter's phenotype because her dad had that recessive trait. So she had to get that recessive allele from him. So you can look forward like that. Parents that have that recessive trait have to pass on that recessive allele, so you can fill in some blanks. But you can also go backwards. The aunt in generation 2, right? The girl labeled lowercase d, she could have gotten that, she had to have gotten one recessive allele from her dad. So I can go backwards and I can fill in that the grandpa also is heterozygous for this trait. So as you can see from left to right, recessive and dominant are very different. You need to label them differently. Notice that on the right, there's no carriers because it's a dominant trait. There's no such thing as a carrier when it's dominant. So we should probably put that in here somewhere. I think I might have just written off your screen, but you know what I was trying to write. There are no carriers if it's a dominant trait. So again, I didn't know that that was a dominant trait. I just started filling it out like that just to show you an example. If I was to redo that pedigree, and this is the exact same one on this slide, so if you need to pause for a second to draw it in and start labeling it with me, that's fine. But if this happens to be a recessive trait, I don't know if it's dominant or recessive, but if it's recessive, I label it differently. Remember, all the affected individuals are going to have 2 recessive alleles, and all the unaffected individuals are going to have at least 1 dominant allele. We might be able to fill in more after the fact, but we'll have to see. So now I look at it and I see, oh yeah, grandma had to have given that recessive allele to 2 of her offspring, so she's going to have that lowercase d. You know that the dad in the second generation had to have had that lowercase allele, that recessive allele. He passed it on to his daughter. You also know that the grandson is going to have that recessive allele because he got it from his mom. And then finally, the aunt in the second generation, she would have had to have gotten that recessive allele from her dad. So I do actually know the genotypes of every individual, but only if this is recessive. Now remember, the other thing with recessive is there are carriers. So I have to mark all carriers appropriately. And every individual that's unaffected in this pedigree should be a carrier if it is a recessive trait. So I'm going to go through and mark all of those appropriately. But lastly, again, if it is recessive, I also always have to ask, is it sex-linked? So I'm going to look at it and look for evidence as to whether it's sex-linked or not. When I look at this, I'm looking for males that are carriers, and I do see 2 males that should be carriers in this case. And since that's not possible for dad in generation 2 and for the grandson to be carriers, this is not going to be sex-linked. And it's for the same reason as before. It can't be sex-linked if you have carriers that are males. So again, going backwards one more time, I didn't really know if that second pedigree was dominant or not. I just filled it in like it was dominant. It could be dominant, it could be recessive, but that first one was recessive, and I knew that because it skipped a generation. So I'm going to need more information for that second pedigree because I did it once as dominant, second time as recessive, and I can fill it out either way. I'm just going to need more information before I really know which kind it's going to be. All right, so we're good to go.